I think of 2003, a few days after Saddam Hussein was taken into American custody. Among others who were paying attention was the dictator of Libya, who let it be known that we could come and take away his entire inventory of nuclear components, which he did. What kind of weapons might Gaddafi have had in 2011 if he hadn't surrendered his nuclear materials to us long before? And when the uprisings came his way with real trouble outside his compound, how might the dictator have maintained his power? They watch what our leaders do, and they do the enemies of America, and they listen to what our leaders say. And a few of our most single-minded enemies might well have wondered why, in recent years, President Obama was talking about the terrorists being on the run, in retreat, when precisely the opposite was happening. By the estimate of Seth Jones at the Rand Corporation, quote, since 2010, there has been a 58% increase in the number of jihadist groups, a doubling of the number of jihadist fighters, and a tripling of attacks by al-Qaeda affiliates. In other words, while the president was claiming the tide of war was receding and core al-Qaeda had been decimated, the threat was actually increasing. From Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, over to Pakistan, all the way down to Somalia and Nigeria, in various places under various names, a whole new wave of jihadists was on the rise. Likewise, we have the recent account of General Mike Flynn, who just stepped down as director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. He said, and I quote, when asked if terrorists were on the run, we could not respond with any answer but no. When asked if the terrorists were defeated, we had to say no. Anyone who answers yes to either of those questions either doesn't know what they are talking about, they are misinformed, or they are just flat out lying, end quote. The general's point is that the terrorist threat, far from receding like a tide, has been advancing and multiplying. And the Rand report was done before the rise of ISIS and the establishment of a caliphate, a new terrorist safe haven covering vast territory in the heart of the Arab world. ISIS is now attracting thousands of radicals from Europe and potentially hundreds from the United States, eager to join in the slaying of non-believers. A fair number are doubtless intending to return home to Britain, France, and elsewhere. That is, unless their Western passports are canceled, which ought to happen. These are but a few of the features that make the situation today one of the most dangerous we have faced, certainly in my lifetime, and far more dangerous than the administration has been willing to admit. When the president speaks today, we need only to listen carefully for a true understanding of the nature and extent of this danger. And let me suggest a few markers to keep in mind, the basic signs of serious strategic thinking. A realistic strategy has to recognize that ISIS is a grave strategic threat to the United States. The situation is dire, and defeating these terrorists will require immediate, sustained, simultaneous action across multiple fronts. Phasing in our actions will not suffice. Such a strategy will only prolong the conflict and increase the casualties. ISIS does not recognize a border between Syria and Iraq, so neither should we. We should immediately hit them in their sanctuaries, staging areas, command centers, and lines of communication, wherever we find them. We should provide significantly increased numbers of military trainers, special operations forces, and intelligence architecture and air power to aid the Iraqi military and the Kurdish Peshmerga in their counteroffensive against ISIS. We work to defeat ISIS and prevent the establishment of a terrorist safe haven in the heart of the Middle East. We must move globally to get back on offense in the war on terror. This means first recognizing and admitting the size and scope of the threat we face. Al-Qaeda is not diminished, nor is the tide of war receding. Wishing doesn't make it so. Our president must understand we are at war and that we must do what it takes for as long as it takes to win. Winning will require allies. Across the broader Middle East, we have to reassure our friends and allies that America will not abandon them. After 5.5 years of an administration sending regular messages of retreat, withdrawal, and indifference, we have lost credibility and the trust of allies that we need to win this war. We must now demonstrate through increased intelligence activity and cooperation, military assistance, training, joint exercises, and economic support that we know they are on the front line of the war on terror. We should do everything we possible to defend Jordan against ISIS. We should immediately provide the support that the government of Egypt needs to fight the terrorist insurgency in the Sinai. We should recognize that the Muslim Brotherhood is the ideological source for most of the radical Islamist terrorists around the globe. We ought to designate it as the terrorist organization it is, and we should provide full backing and support for those governments across the Middle East who are standing against the Muslim Brotherhood. We should make clear that a nuclear-armed Iran is an existential threat to Israel and to other nations in the region as well. We should refuse to accept any deal that allows them to continue to spin centrifuges and enrich uranium. The regime in Tehran must be made to understand that the United States will not allow that to happen and that we will take military action if necessary to stop it. To avoid repeating President Obama's arbitrary and hasty withdrawal of residual forces from Iraq, the tragic era that gave us the caliphate, we should have the drawdown of our troops in Afghanistan halted. The terror and chaos in Iraq today will only be replaced in Afghanistan if we have now abandoned that country. I might add that by now, with all that's happening in Iraq and well beyond, we should hear no more talk about treating the fight against terror as a matter for law enforcement. The idea that terrorists are just criminals of a different stripe has been a dogma of this administration from the very beginning, and it's time we put it to rest once and for all. All that we achieved in protecting the country after 9/11 came from the understanding that terrorists are not just common lawbreakers, and terrorism is not just street crime on a bigger scale. Despite years of criticizing those policies, President Obama himself has lately been pointing to the Bush-Cheney security apparatus as evidence that he's keeping America safe. And this is a quote. Since 9/11, he said at a fundraiser last month, we have built up a security apparatus that makes us in the here and now pretty safe. Nice to hear. Especially from someone who used to speak so disparagingly about the steps we took after 9/11. After years of saying that America had lost its way, abandoned our values, in building up the security apparatus, now he's invoking it to give assurance that we are prepared. I know something about the apparatus. I was one of its architects, and President Obama seems willfully blind to one of the key facts about the post-9/11 security apparatus. It is not self-sustaining. Those programs and policies must be kept strong and current. The Obama administration has failed utterly in that task. After 5.5 years of dismantling the apparatus we put in place, he cannot honestly claim that same apparatus will now keep us safe. And this is the most critical measure we could apply to the President's remarks today. Any serious strategy has to include a major new commitment to restoring our nation's military preparedness. We simply cannot pursue a comprehensive strategy against terrorism. At the same time, we're sending pink slips to captains and majors in the combat zone. And yet this and more is happening. In this very time of hasty withdrawals, continuous disengagement, and such self-congratulations for all of it, we have also seen dramatic and devastating drawdowns in the military power of the United States. Ours is the power that underlies so much else, yet even this has been taken for granted during these years. We're nearing a crisis point in the decline of American military power. It has to be addressed, and right away. The administration should be aware of this by now because of the bipartisan National Defense Panel, appointed by the President's own Defense Secretary, recently warned of untenable reductions in force levels. It's a bipartisan group chaired by John Abizaid and by Bill Perry, former Secretary of Defense. They did a superb job, and I commend it to anybody who's interested. If we take almost any element of our defense capability, and it has been reduced in some cases with further reductions to come, Army, Air Force, Navy, and Marines, all of them have been subjected to irrational budget cuts having nothing to do with the strategic needs of national security. Soon, for instance, we'll actually be looking at an Army and Marine Corps with authorized strength levels beneath what they were prior to 9/11. Of the Army's 40 brigades, only 4 are combat ready. Meanwhile, we've seen crucial programs and weapon systems delayed or canceled, either arbitrarily or else by the flimsiest of rationales.